then we might be lucky enough to be on time to move on to our next speaker, who's Billy Clark. I don't think he needs any introduction from us. Hello, Billy. And he'll be talking about the relationship between relevance theory and listening today. And Billy, I hope you can hear me and your mic's on.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm sort of in the spirit of what I think of as the spirit of the Relevance Researchers Network, which is introducing new things that maybe you're just getting going with, and hoping that people have got some good ideas to share about what I'm talking about. And I would say that what I'm saying might be a little bit paradoxical because it's relevance and listening, but I've come to this because of thinking about production, about how people produce utterances, and that has led me to think about how we produce and comprehend, and led me on to think relevance theory could be quite useful in thinking about what is involved in listening and perceptions of what makes somebody a good listener. And I think one of the things about what I'm saying today is it's about things that people have said already from a lot of different perspectives. So in psychology, to some extent in linguistics, and I'm considering to what extent ideas from relevance theory can be useful in contributing to how we understand what's going on when people are listening. So I'm going to lead to that in a series of stages. So the general idea, I think, is that ideas from relevance theory can contribute to understanding of what's involved in listening. And I've used small caps and a star because I realize that listening can mean a lot of different things. But what I'm partly focused on here is what makes somebody a good listener. And the paradox raises itself because I think being a good listener is partly about being a good communicator. So it's about what you produce while somebody is interacting with you will make you be perceived as either a good listener or not. Okay, and I got interested in this idea partly thinking about production and comprehension. I've been working with Q Hyun Park, whose PhD is on relevance theory and the production of utterances. And one of the things that Q has concluded is that, of course, production and comprehension are closely related, and people are typically both producing utterances and understanding utterances at the same time. I put at the same time in inverted commas because there's variation on exactly what's going on. So at the moment, I'm producing utterances and you are all understanding them. Are you producing utterances at the same time? Well, you might be thinking, I wonder if I've got a question about this, and so on. And then there's other questions about things like if somebody writes a book that somebody reads a lot later, are they involved in comprehension at the same time as they're involved in production? I would argue possibly, because they're mentally representing what other people will comprehend as they produce it. So there's a lot of complexity there. Both production and comprehension are complex, and both of them involve a lot of effort, and I assume, and that's part of what contributes to my understanding of what's going on. The third bullet there, the dot, should be a slash. Both are relevance guided / constrained. So I think we often are producing and comprehending at the same time. Both producing and comprehending take a lot of cognitive effort, and relevance is involved in both. And I'm unsure about how exactly to talk about relevance. Is it guided? Is relevance constraining things? And also I notice that sometimes we talk about things like considerations of relevance, but we don't really mean that people are sitting around considering things. So it gets very tricky to think about the exact words that you want to use. But what I'm essentially getting at is I think ideas from relevance theory will help us to understand production and comprehension. Okay, leading into talking about production is the idea that has often been expressed that approaches to pragmatics like Grice's approach and also relevance theory have often been seen as very much hearer-focused. So people will say, oh, the thing about Grice is he really only talks about what hearers do. And similarly, people have said that about relevance theory. But once you start thinking about it, it's clear that both Grice and Sperber and Wilson and relevance theorists do say things about what communicators are doing. And I've just put on this slide, very well known to many of you, extract from Grice's Logic and Conversation, where he describes how somebody infers what somebody else could be meaning, how somebody works out an implicature. He has said that P, no reason to suppose he's not observing the maxims and so on. He couldn't be doing this unless he thought that Q, and then this important sort of reflexive bit, he knows and knows that I know that he knows that I can see that the supposition that he thinks that Q is required. He hasn't stopped me thinking it. He must be at least willing to let me think it, so I'm going to decide that he's implicated it. And that reflexive thing is really important because to me it suggests that speakers are thinking about what hearers will do, and hearers are thinking about what speakers think about what hearers will do. And so there's this complicated reflexive thing going on. In relevance theory, I thought about a bunch of different things I could use as a quote here, but central idea in relevance theory is that a communicator who produces an ostensive stimulus is trying to fulfill two intentions, an informative intention and a communicative intention. So automatically we're talking about what communicators are trying to do. And one thing that I didn't find the right quote to use for this, but that Q and I have noticed quite often is when you read accounts of the interpretation of utterances, they very, very often talk about what speakers have done. So somebody talking about why somebody has produced a loose, non-literal utterance rather than a literal one will instantly start talking about the communicator chose this because they could see that the addressee would infer this range of assumptions and so on. So I don't really agree that Grice and relevance theory are as hero-focused as people have suggested. Okay, pragmatics and production in general, I would say there's been increasing interest in this in recent years. I've only mentioned a few people here, Kesh and Ray Gibbs working with Bryant, Colston and Van Orden have said some things about production. Gibbs adopts some ideas from relevance theory, Kesh not so much. And of course, there has been work on relevance theory and production in the past. And one well-known thing is the work by van der Henst et al., in which they find evidence that communicators are making effort to consider what is likely to be relevant to addressees. So many of you will know about this work where people were asking strangers what time it is, and then they were noticing whether people gave rounded answers. So they didn't even have to check whether it was 7 minutes past 10 or 10 past 10. They just asked people what time it was, and so it was a rounded number or not, and then worked out that if it was just random, 1 out of every 5 minutes would be rounded to 5. And so therefore a fifth of the answers should be rounded, but they found more than those were rounded systematically. So therefore communicators are making the effort to go from noticing that it's 8 minutes past 10 to saying that it's 10 past 10 in order to be more likely to be relevant to their addressees by saving them the effort of thinking about what exactly 8 means and so on. They also manipulated the stimuli in various ways. So for example, they would walk up with a watch in their hand and say, my watch is broken, what time is it? More likely that they're going to get a more accurate answer in those cases. Or if they say they're late for a meeting, they're going to get a more accurate answer. So there's some work showing that pragmatic things are affecting production of utterances, and that specifically they have to do with relevance. Hyun Park in her PhD has proposed that there's a heuristic guide in production. So just like comprehension is guided by a heuristic, there's a relevance guided heuristic. Q has wondered whether to say guided, focused, or some other word, but that considerations of relevance, and again, I hesitate when I hear the word considerations, but relevance has got something to do with what we produce. And she's gathered some empirical evidence showing how communicators formulate utterances differently for different audiences. And again, I've put there that this is including for imagined audiences who are briefly described in task materials. So you say to somebody, here's a picture, describe what's going on in the picture. Now tell your friend, now imagine that you're a babysitter and you're telling your friend about what happened in the picture. And then in another version, now imagine you're talking to the parents of the kids that you've been babysitting and tell them what happened in the picture. And people seem to be willing to put the effort into imagining, if I was a babysitter and if I was talking to my best friend, these are the kinds of things I would say. So it seems it's quite natural for us to put a bit of effort into thinking about what exactly will be the right thing to say in this context to these people. Okay, I want to relate this to work on turn taking. So there's been a lot of work on turn taking recently by Levinson and others in particular. And one of the things that is often stressed in work on turn taking is how very, very quickly it happens. So of course, me talking now, it's a bit different because your turn is going to come at the end and it's all a bit institutionalized. But in an everyday interaction, it's very quickly that people respond to each other. And the evidence seems to be that it's actually more quickly than it's possible to do it. So given the time that it takes to formulate an utterance, it doesn't seem that there's enough time for me to respond to something you say in the time it actually takes. So I've got a slide with a quote from Levinson and Torreira here. The gaps between, sorry, I've got your faces on top of the thing. The gaps between turns are short, they're around 200 milliseconds, but the latencies involved in language production are much longer, over 600 milliseconds. So the way that you measure that is you say to somebody, here's a picture, tell me what it is. And you time how long it takes for them to tell you what it is. And they tend to take 600 milliseconds. But if you look at people interacting with each other, if you're talking to me, I seem to start speaking around 200 milliseconds after you've finished. Therefore, as the quote says, this seems to imply participants in conversation must predict or project the end of the current speaker's turn in order to prepare their response in advance. So there must be some advanced planning going on. Oops. Okay, so turn taking presents a puzzle. In spite of the long latencies involved in language production, participants often manage to achieve smooth turn transitions. As a solution, we suggest that comprehension is predictive, even more so than is currently thought. As soon as possible, participants extract the speech act of the incoming utterance, maybe not the term that everybody would use there, and in order to overcome the production latencies, they must also start planning and encoding the response as soon as possible. Okay, this is a diagram that Levinson and Torreira use to talk about what's going on, and I've got a zoomed in version here. So we've got a bunch of things going on in comprehension and a bunch of things going on in production. So in comprehension, you're thinking things like, is there a syntactic closure coming up? Is there a clear action here? What prosodic cues are there, and so on. In production, I've got to start planning my response. I've got to start formulating things. I've got to prepare the articulators, and I've got to get my utterance out. And one of the things I think there is I'm wondering what relevance theory has to say about those bits at the bottom. Once we start planning our response and formulating it, what exactly are we doing? It's one thing to say, it's very quick and I plan something and I say something, but how do I assess what is going to be likely to be the thing that I'm going to say? This is a blog post which people who are on the Relevance mailing list will have seen. Dan Sperber shared this blog about a month ago, I think, and it seemed to me to fit very well what I'm thinking about. So this is Ruth Cork talking about conversation not being like a game of ping pong. And so she's reporting on data where they were looking at corpus data on interactions. And they said, we considered what speakers actually said to each other. Often we think of a conversation as involving an exchange of ideas, where one speaker directly responds to something said by the previous speaker. But surprisingly, we saw that speakers often did not respond to each other at all, and instead developed their turns in parallel with the partner. And then there's an example from the corpus here. So Pamela says, the food is like all unique. Daryl says, hey. Pamela says, and wonderful. Daryl says, it's major league yin and yang. And Pamela says, and heavenly. And I think one way of looking at that is if you remove the two Daryl utterances, it wouldn't seem to affect what Pamela says. The food is like all unique and wonderful and heavenly. And there's no evidence that Daryl finds this problematic at all. So in Dan's email, he said this might suggest that we should be investigating exactly what counts as relevant enough in an interaction. It seems like it might be a lot looser than people generally think. So it might be that I don't have to say something about what Daryl says. As long as I say something that's got something to do with the interaction we've got ongoing, things will be okay. Okay, I'm going to sidetrack a wee bit. When I see that kind of thing, it makes me think of script writing. And I've always thought that pragmatics and relevance theory are relevant to script writing. This is the screenwriter William Goldman, who was a very well-known scriptwriter. He wrote films like The Princess Bride, which is, the greatest film ever made, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and other things. And that's a very famous book he wrote called Adventures in the Screen Trade. One thing that he talks about there is subtext. I realize I've only got 5 minutes left, but I will just say anybody who's interested in pragmatics will hear filmmakers talking about subtext and think, okay, that's about inferring things that go beyond just what the words said are. I think I'll skip quickly. What I will say is that Goldman seems to be talking about subtext as being about what the film as a whole is communicating to viewers more than the characters interacting with each other. So taking one example, he talks about the film All About Eve, with Bette Davis playing a character who is quite upset about how things are going in life, and she's got a very young, keen actress working with her. Utters a famous line, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night." And then I've just screen grabbed some bits. She behaves outrageously, but you don't hate her, because the sequence isn't about how Meryl was late, and it isn't about Davis being jealous of Anne Baxter. He's given the actors' names there rather than the characters. It's about her terrifying fear of aging, and it's funny and it's sad. Okay, but that's a bit of a sidetrack. I want to talk about a different kind of bad script writing. Sometimes I have seen in TV shows and sometimes in films interactions that go like this, and it's very common when people start script writing. Somebody walks in the room and says, "How are you today?" The other person says, "I'm fine, thanks. How are you?" The first person says, "Not too bad, thanks." And the next person says, "What are your plans for the day?" We all know that that is nothing like how real interactions happen. And so the work by Corp and others makes me think about that. What's really going on when we interact? So all of that's got me thinking that communication is really complicated. We're producing and comprehending often simultaneously, or at least overlapping with each other. We've got lots of time pressures going on. It's hard to explain how exactly we manage it. Now I want to bring that into thinking about listening, because listening means being involved in an interaction where we're producing and comprehending at the same time. And I think that's what's going to make it quite hard. And our everyday intuitions about what makes conversations go wrong are easy to map onto those kinds of things. Like, I was talking about this person then came on and said something about what happened to them, but I wanted them to listen to what happened to me, and so on and so on. So how can relevance theory help? This is sort of the main thing I want to say today. We think that relevance is important in communication and interaction. And a key idea there is we think it involves ongoing adjustments in the manifestness or mutual manifestness of assumptions. So it's not a case of asking somebody how they are today and being told that they're fine. There's a whole bunch of different assumptions being made manifest by how I walk into the room, how I look at you, how I pronounce the words, "How are you today?" and so on. So there's lots of little adjustments going on through our interaction. And our interaction provides evidence for a range of implicatures and implications. So some things that I'm communicating, you're going to think I'm intentionally trying to get you to see that, for example, I care about you enough to ask how you are today. But other things could be things like non-communicated implications, like Billy seems a bit tired or whatever. And also we want to take account of verbal and non-verbal behavior. So very quickly, I can only give a hint now. What I think I'm proposing that the next steps will be put some more pragmatics into work and turn taking. So don't just think about how come we manage it so quickly, but get into the details of which things are we producing to give rise to which kinds of implicatures and implications. Think about implications as well as implicatures. Explore what makes people seem to be good listeners. So I think this is going to have to involve looking at real interactions and interviewing people who take part in them to get a sense of what makes them think, that was a good interaction and I got on well with that person. And it will include linguistic and non-linguistic behavior, including silence. And in the 50 seconds I've got left, I want to say, if we looked at Pamela and Daryl there, we could ask questions like, what exactly is being implied and or implicated throughout this exchange? What role are non-linguistic behaviors playing? How do people vary in perceptions, how this has all gone? And I grabbed some things from, I've been looking at a lot of these kinds of things, people giving advice on how to listen. And I'm proposing to get into the details of some of these things. So this is from Positive Psychology. Advice on active listening, which I guess a lot of you know about. Active listening is about not just sitting there hearing somebody speak, but doing things and how you think of, not only how you respond to them, but how you look and behave while they're speaking. And there are things in it about things like adopting the other person's perspective. There are things like the difference between giving little things to encourage people, asking open-ended questions rather than closed ones. So saying things like, how do you feel about your relationship, rather than do you feel your relationship is failing? And my last example, I thought I wanted to put this one in because I think it shows that the question about variability. Here's an example, and it says a client says to a counselor, it's in the middle there near the bottom, this is a waste of time. My parents are idiots. They just don't get me. And the advice on this website is the counselor could say, you're angry coming here because you feel your parents are the ones with the problems. And it seems to me that's being suggested as a way to break down resistance by acknowledging the other person's point of view. But I could see a lot of people could get annoyed by the counselor saying that, because it's not, it's sort of a presuming to understand what's going on. And so I guess that's a really quick presentation of a whole bunch of questions that I think that Ideas from Pragmatics can help with. And I think I've actually gone over my time a wee bit.
Thank you, Billy. No, you stuck to time, and it's you have to. Thank you for your thought-provoking speech, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions from the floor. So I'll just open the floor. Round of applause first and foremost. A round of applause, and I'll just open the floor to any questions that might come from the audience. Erica just raised a hand. Erica, where are you? Can I see you? Can I not?
Yeah, here. Hi. Hi. Thank you, Billy, very much for a very interesting talk. I definitely learned a lot about the role of listening in communication. So I was wondering, particularly when you're talking about turn taking, I was thinking about L2 learners. So when we learn a new language and we participate in turn taking, we very carefully plan in advance what we want to say before we actually formulate it. So I was wondering what role would Relevance has in these adjustments you were talking about in learning an L2 language or in L2 communication?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I don't know the answer, but I think it's really complicated. And I know, having been an L2 speaker, that it's one of the things that causes me the biggest problem, because in my L1, I don't get stressed so much about what I'm going to say in my turn and whether I've understood everything that's going on and so on. And in an L2 context, I'm kind of freaking out because I know that I'm not doing it the same way as the L1 people are, but I can't really understand what it is that I'm getting a bit wrong. And I suppose what I'm hoping is that if we develop an account of what makes something seem relevant enough in a context, it might be possible to help L2 speakers to think about, well, we're having a chat here about this topic. As long as I'm saying something that's got something to do with this topic, it'll probably be okay. And if I haven't quite understood what that other person said, they might repeat it and say, yeah, but I was also saying this, and then we'll get there in the end. And that's what happens between L1 speakers all the time, but we just don't get stressed out about it because we're confident in our first language. I mean, it's not really an answer, but that's the kinds of things that are in my mind thinking about that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. We've got another hand, Francesco. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for this talk. Very interesting. It's just a very small remark. A potentially interesting case study for you might be TV shows, in interviews, in which there seems to be, these are interesting cases to me because there seems to be a coordination that is at work between the audience that is listening, the interviewer that is a listener, but a very special kind of listener, right? Because he has to listen, but has to make interesting questions that are interesting, that are relevant not just for the addressee, but also for the audience. And yes, silence, reactions by the public. This is a very complex scenario, but at the same time, it's very easy. There is a lot of material about that. And I've seen linguists studying, for instance, gestures in TV interviews. And there is a lot of material that can be analyzed that is basically up for grabs. And it might be just that, might be an interesting case. Yeah.
Thanks. No, yeah, I'm aware that there's loads of work on that. And I guess what I'm thinking is putting some of the pragmatics in could be really helpful. And of course, I'm aware of the complexity of those contexts. It really is complicated. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of specific examples I've got in mind of those kinds of things. Like, and actually, the planning can be quite different because the person being interviewed quite often has planned a lot in advance what they're going to say, including I've actually had media training through my university. And one of the first lessons is don't worry too much about what the person's asking you. Go in there with the message you want to get across and say that almost regardless of what they ask you. And we've all seen that kind of thing going on. Adding in, of course, the complexity that some of these things audiences are dropping in and out of. So the other thing my media trainer says as a first lesson is never use a pronoun. Don't say we're doing this. Say our research team here at Northumbria University are doing this. So you always remind people in case they dropped in the middle. So yeah, I think there's lots and lots to think about there.
Very interesting. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bridget. Just to add to that, I'm about to start analyzing data from asylum interpreter mediated communication. You can imagine what kind of straighter and straighter implications and implicatures are being made. And so I think, interpreter mediated communication is just next level, isn't it? When a lot of assumptions are being made manifest and you have to, and there's a lot of turn taking, overlapping and turn taking, obviously. So looking forward to further research on your part. We've got a question from Ryoko as well. Sorry.
Hi, Billy. It was very interesting. Thanks. And I just had to pop out for 5 minutes. I might have missed you mentioned this, but from listening to what your presentation, it kind of struck me that it might also be interesting to look at, say, people with autism and other people who are not. Well, I'm sorry, I forgot the right way of referring to the particular population. But and like Erica mentioned L2, but I think a lot of what you said would be applicable for other type of population as well, and including those who are not that good at, say, social chit chat.
Yeah. No, I didn't say anything about that, but it is, of course, really important. And one of the things about this is it's such a huge topic because you could think about listening in all these different kinds of contexts with all these different kinds of, minds and people and roles and institutions and on and on. So yeah, definitely something to think about as well. And also awareness, the awareness we've each got of each other, so like, somebody said to me yesterday, I'm autistic, before they carried on with our conversation, because they wanted me to be aware of that and to think about how they would respond in different ways,
So I think, I thought your talk was very important in that, relevance theory can really go into more sort of inclusivity and diversity, talking more about the societal impact, we are asked to think about now. So thank you, it was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Lovely talks, I might say, plural, from this session. If no one else got any questions for Billy in particular, I want to thank you all for tuning in and listening, and for all your implications and implicatures, and thank the speakers in particular for the lovely talk. And I want to say we've got half an hour break. Am I right, Ryoko? Before we start again, and you can obviously tune into different sessions and whatnot. And I'll see you hopefully in my session where I'll speak in a couple of hours. So thank you all again, and have a lovely lunch break, and I'll see you in about half an hour.